The first time I saw my late mother's diamond necklace after her funeral, it wasn't around someone's neck. It was described on a faded pawn ticket sitting on my lawyer's desk. Who had sold it? Why had my stepmother spent almost a year insisting every piece of Mom's jewelry was still locked inside our family safe? And why had an anonymous stranger risked mailing that ticket directly to my attorney instead of the police? When I called Monica, she snapped, "Stop digging through the past before you destroy this family." That's when I realized the missing jewelry wasn't the biggest secret. It was only the first one. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your country and your local time in the comments, because I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and finding the truth through patience and evidence are your kind of stories, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and stay with me for the rest of this journey. I grew up believing that some objects could carry an entire lifetime inside them. My mother, Isabella Vasquez, used to laugh whenever people called her jewelry collection expensive. "They're only expensive to insurance companies," she'd say, as she fastened a clasp behind her neck. "To me, they're memories." She wasn't talking about diamonds or gold. She was talking about the Christmas bracelet her grandmother wore after immigrating from New Mexico to Illinois with little more than a suitcase. She meant the sapphire earrings my father surprised her with after finally paying off their first mortgage. She meant the tiny emerald pendant she bought with her very first bonus after becoming a registered nurse. Every piece had a story, every story had a date, and every date was written down somewhere. That was my mother. She documented everything. As a certified public accountant, I sometimes joked that my obsession with records came from her. She would smile and reply, "No, sweetheart. Records don't protect money. They protect the truth." I didn't fully understand what she meant until years after she was gone. My parents had been married for almost 28 years. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was steady. Dad, Daniel Vasquez, worked as a civil engineer for most of his career. Mom spent more than 30 years as a nurse. Neither of them came from wealth. Everything they owned had been built slowly. Vacations were planned months in advance. Cars stayed in the family until repairing them cost more than replacing them. Luxury wasn't part of our lifestyle. Sentimental things were. Mom's jewelry collection wasn't enormous. It filled one velvet-lined drawer inside a fireproof safe in their bedroom closet. There were perhaps 25 pieces altogether, a few diamonds, some pearls, vintage brooches, family heirlooms, nothing that looked outrageous. Yet together they represented decades of family history. She photographed every item, kept every appraisal, updated insurance documents every few years, stored certificates inside neatly labeled folders. As a teenager, I teased her for treating jewelry like business assets. She would grin. "One day you'll appreciate organized paperwork." She was right. Just not in the way either of us imagined. Everything changed the year she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. At first, she insisted life would continue normally. She kept working longer than her doctors wanted. She still hosted Thanksgiving. She still remembered everyone's birthdays. She still worried more about other people than herself. The illness moved faster than any of us expected. Over 18 difficult months, I watched the strongest woman I'd ever known become physically smaller while somehow remaining emotionally larger. She never complained. Even during chemotherapy, even after surgeries, even when exhaustion made simply walking across the room difficult. One afternoon, while I was helping organize paperwork for insurance reimbursements, she handed me a thick blue binder. "If anything ever happens," she said quietly, "everything important is here." I frowned. "Nothing's happening." She smiled the kind of smile parents use when they're trying not to frighten their children. "Humor me." Inside were investment statements, Insurance policies, property records, medical directives, a detailed household inventory, even emergency contact lists. Everything was labeled, everything made sense. I remember laughing. "This is the most mom binder ever created." She laughed too. "I'll take that as a compliment." I tucked the binder back onto her office shelf after updating one insurance receipt. Neither of us knew that would be one of the last afternoons we'd spend talking about ordinary things. She passed away 11 months later. The funeral was beautiful. Friends from the hospital came. Former patients sent flowers. Neighbors brought food for days afterward. People told stories about how Isabella had sat beside frightened strangers during night shifts, how she'd stayed after work without being asked, how she'd quietly paid for medication a patient couldn't afford. Listening to those stories made me proud. It also made going home almost unbearable. The house suddenly sounded different, too quiet, too organized, too empty. Dad withdrew into himself. He wandered from room to room as though he'd forgotten why he'd entered them. I worried about him constantly. So did everyone else, including Monica Reynolds. She had known my parents socially through a local charity board years earlier. She reappeared several months after the funeral, first as someone checking on Dad, then as a friend, then as someone bringing dinner, helping with errands, making sure he wasn't alone. At first I appreciated her. She seemed patient, gentle, practical. Dad smiled again when she visited. After months of grief, I wanted that for him. Nobody questioned her intentions, least of all me. About 18 months later, they married quietly. Only immediate family attended. I remember telling myself life had to move forward eventually. I genuinely hoped she'd bring peace back into our family. Instead, she slowly took control of it. Not dramatically, not overnight, almost invisibly. She organized closets, changed household routines, updated furniture, handled insurance renewals, started managing bills because, according to her, Dad found paperwork emotionally overwhelming. That sounded reasonable. Dad agreed. I agreed. Looking back now, I realize how carefully every responsibility drifted toward Monica. Not because anyone demanded it, because she volunteered. Repeatedly, until no one questioned it anymore. The subject of my mother's jewelry surfaced only once during those first months. I asked Dad whether we should move everything into a bank safety deposit box. Before he answered, Monica smiled sympathetically. "I don't think Daniel is ready to go through Isabella's things." Dad looked relieved. "Maybe later." That seemed fair. Several more months passed. I mentioned it again. Monica placed her hand gently over mine. "I opened the closet yesterday." Her voice softened. "I couldn't even look at the safe without crying." Immediately, I felt guilty. "I'm sorry." She squeezed my fingers. "We'll do it together someday." That someday never arrived. Whenever I asked, there was another reason. Dad had a difficult week. The holidays were approaching. The anniversary of Mom's death was coming. Family was visiting. Someone wasn't emotionally prepared. The timing wasn't right. I stopped asking, not because I lost interest, because I believed compassion mattered more than property. Now I understand something else. Delays are sometimes a strategy. Not every manipulation sounds cruel. Sometimes it sounds caring. Nearly a year after Dad remarried, I stood inside my parents' bedroom holding the anonymous pawn ticket Ethan had received. Dad had gone fishing with friends. Monica was out meeting someone for lunch. For the first time since Mom's funeral, I unlocked the safe myself, using the emergency combination Dad had texted me years earlier. The heavy metal door swung open with the same mechanical click I remembered. Inside sat the familiar velvet jewelry boxes, exactly where they'd always been. For one brief, hopeful moment, I almost laughed at myself. Maybe this really was a misunderstanding. Maybe the pawn ticket belonged to another necklace with a similar description. Maybe someone had made an error. Hands shaking slightly, I lifted the first burgundy box. It was empty. I opened the second. Empty. The third. Empty again. Then another. And another. Several boxes still held jewelry, but far too many contained nothing except faded velvet impressions where rings, necklaces, and bracelets had rested for decades. I felt the room tilt beneath me. This wasn't one missing necklace. This wasn't one dishonest sale. Someone had been removing pieces one by one for months, carefully leaving every empty box exactly where it belonged. I reached for the largest box in the back of the safe, the one that had always held my mother's diamond necklace. Before I could lift the lid, I heard the bedroom door open behind me. "I was wondering," Monica said calmly, "how long it would take before you finally looked." I didn't slam the jewelry box shut. I didn't accuse Monica, and I didn't turn around immediately. Years of working in forensic accounting had taught me something that became almost instinctive over time. The first person to speak after discovering evidence usually reveals more than the person who stays silent, so I kept my eyes on the open safe. "I was wondering," Monica repeated, her voice unusually calm, "how long it would take before you finally looked." Only then did I turn toward her. She was still wearing her beige trench coat, her purse hanging from one shoulder as if she had just come home. There wasn't a trace of surprise on her face, no panic, no confusion, no attempt to ask what I was doing. She wasn't reacting to what she saw. She already knew exactly what I would find. I held up one of the empty velvet boxes. "Where is it?" She sighed dramatically. "I hoped your father and I wouldn't have to revisit this." "Revisit what?" She walked into the room slowly, as though we were discussing old photo albums instead of missing family heirlooms. "Your mother sold several pieces before she passed." I stared at her. "No, she didn't." Monica folded her arms. "Raylan, cancer treatment is expensive." I didn't answer. She continued. "She didn't want you worrying about money. She asked us not to tell you." The explanation sounded polished, almost rehearsed. If someone had never met my mother, it might even have sounded believable. But I had spent the last 18 months helping Isabella organize insurance claims, medical reimbursements, and investment withdrawals. I knew how she handled finances. She never hid transactions. Never. "If Mom sold them?" I asked quietly. "Where's the paperwork?" Monica shrugged. "Not everything gets documented." That sentence landed harder than she realized, because my mother documented everything. Every insurance renewal, every appraisal, every charitable donation, every medical reimbursement. She once kept a receipt for a blender because it came with a 5-year warranty. She absolutely would have documented selling heirloom jewelry worth tens of thousands of dollars. Monica must have noticed my expression. "You're looking at me like you don't believe me." "I don't." She let out an irritated breath. "I knew this would happen." "What exactly did she sell?" "I don't remember." "You don't remember?" "There were several pieces." "Which ones?" I said I don't remember. "Who bought them?" "I wasn't involved." "But you just said Mom sold them?" "I mean," Monica hesitated for less than a second before correcting herself. "She handled everything herself." There it was, the first inconsistency. A few seconds earlier, she had spoken as though she knew the entire story. Now she claimed she hadn't been involved at all. I didn't point it out. Not yet. Dad came home 40 minutes later. He looked surprised to find both of us sitting silently at the dining room table. "Everything okay?" Monica answered before I could. "Raylan finally opened the safe." Dad's shoulders dropped slightly. "Oh." I watched his face carefully. There was sadness, but not surprise. Had he known? Or had Monica prepared him for this conversation months ago? I slid one of the empty jewelry boxes across the table. Dad. He looked at it without touching it. Monica says Mom sold the jewelry during treatment. He rubbed his forehead. I think she mentioned something like that. You think it was a difficult time? Dad. I honestly don't remember every conversation. He looked exhausted. Older than I remembered. Grief had aged him in ways retirement never could. I wanted to believe him. Part of me still did, because confusion is different from deception. Monica leaned forward. Your father was overwhelmed. I understand that. She continued. Your mother didn't want him worrying about finances. Again. Another carefully polished sentence. It sounded compassionate, reasonable, almost impossible to argue against emotionally. Except emotions weren't enough anymore. Facts mattered. So where did the money go? Silence. I looked at Dad. If Mom sold nearly half her jewelry collection, where's the money? Dad frowned. I don't know. Did it go toward medical bills? I assumed. You assumed? He looked toward Monica. She answered instead. It was years ago. It wasn't years ago. A lot happened. I know exactly how much happened. Monica smiled tightly. Raylin. What hospital invoices were paid with that money? I don't remember. What investment account received the deposits? I don't know. What jeweler bought them? Silence. What bank handled the transaction? Silence again. Finally, she looked directly at me. I think you're becoming obsessed. That sentence almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. When facts become uncomfortable, some people stop arguing the facts. They start questioning the person asking them. I left without raising my voice, without accusing anyone, without threatening lawsuits. On the drive home, I called Ethan. Don't confront them anymore, he said after listening quietly. I wasn't planning to. Good. I think she's lying. I think she is too. What now? We verify. That single word settled my nerves. Verify. Not speculate, not assume. Verify. It was the same advice I'd given clients for years whenever fraud was suspected. Evidence first, conclusions later. The following morning, I requested copies of every medical payment connected to my mother's treatment. Because I had previously been listed as an authorized contact during portions of her care, obtaining many of the billing summaries wasn't difficult. Over the next several days, I spread documents across my dining room table, hospital invoices, insurance explanation of benefit statements, pharmacy receipts, investment withdrawals, checking account statements, savings account transfers, credit card records. I built a timeline across my wall using removable sticky notes. Blue represented medical expenses, green represented insurance reimbursements, yellow represented investment transfers, red marked anything unusual. After 3 days, the pattern became obvious. Medical bills were enormous, but they had been paid. Insurance covered far more than I'd remembered. The remaining balance came from my mother's investment account. Every withdrawal matched an invoice. Every payment had supporting documentation. Nothing was missing. Nothing suggested emergency cash from jewelry sales. I checked again, then a third time. The numbers balanced perfectly. If Isabella had sold jewelry worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, there should have been deposits. There weren't. Not one. On the 4th day, I remembered the blue binder, the one Mom had handed me during chemotherapy. If anything ever happens... I had taken it home after the funeral because Dad said he couldn't bear looking through paperwork. Until now, I had focused mostly on the financial sections. This time I flipped through every divider: insurance, property, investments, medical, personal correspondence. Near the back was a smaller envelope labeled simply "Jewelry Documentation." Inside were photographs, appraisal reports, updated insurance schedules, purchase certificates. Each page was dated. Everything was exactly as I remembered. Then one appraisal caught my attention. My mother's diamond necklace. Policy renewal date September 14th. I stared at it. Mom passed away in March, which meant the insurance policy had been renewed only 6 months before she died. People don't spend money renewing insurance on valuable jewelry they've already sold. I immediately checked the accompanying appraisal. The inspection had been completed in person. The jeweler had physically examined the necklace. That meant the necklace unquestionably existed 6 months before Mom died. Not years earlier, not before treatment. Exactly when Monica claimed it had supposedly already been sold. My heartbeat quickened. I scanned the remaining reports: bracelets, earrings, brooches. Several had also been reappraised during the same appointment. Every one of those pieces was now missing from the safe. Someone hadn't invented a vague story. Someone had invented a timeline, and timelines are much easier to disprove than memories. Just as I reached for my phone to call Ethan, an email notification appeared on my laptop. The sender's name made me stop breathing for a second. It wasn't someone I knew. The subject line read, "I think you should see this before your stepmother does." I didn't open the email immediately. That probably sounds strange. Most people would have clicked it without thinking, but I'd spent too many years investigating financial fraud to ignore one simple rule. Unknown emails can be dangerous. Unknown emails that arrive immediately after a major discovery deserve even more caution. I forwarded it to Ethan first. His reply came less than 15 minutes later. "Safe to open. Looks legitimate. Call me after you read it." Only then did I double-click. There was no greeting, no explanation, only one sentence. "You are looking in the right place, but the pawn ticket wasn't the first sale." Attached were 3 scanned documents. Each was grainy, slightly crooked, and obviously photographed with a phone. The first showed another pawn receipt. The second looked like a purchase intake form. The third was impossible to mistake. It was a photocopy of my mother's emerald bracelet appraisal with handwritten notes beside it. One line had been circled. Item ID EV48. The same identification number appeared on the pawn receipt. Whoever sent this email knew exactly how the jewelry had been documented. More importantly, they knew which documents matched which transactions. I called Ethan. "You've seen them." "I have." "What do you think?" "I think whoever sent this had access to records most people wouldn't." "You think it's someone from the pawn shop?" "Maybe." "Or insurance?" "Maybe." He paused. "But don't focus on who sent it yet." "What should I focus on?" "The documents tell us there's a paper trail." The next morning, Ethan and I drove to the jewelry appraiser whose name appeared on nearly every insurance record. His office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had probably looked exactly the same for 30 years. The owner, Harold Whitmore, was nearing retirement. He wore thick glasses and recognized my mother's name before I finished introducing myself. "Isabella Vasquez." He smiled sadly. She never missed an appraisal appointment. That sentence hurt more than I expected. I asked whether he remembered the diamond necklace. I remember all of hers." He opened an old digital archive. Within minutes, photographs appeared on his monitor. The necklace, the emerald bracelet, the sapphire earrings, several brooches. Every image carried inspection dates, measurements, stone quality, insurance values. Harold enlarged one photograph. "I took this 6 months before she passed." Exactly what I'd already suspected. I asked quietly, would she have needed to bring the necklace here? Absolutely. I inspect the actual piece every renewal. So there is no possibility she'd sold it before this appointment. He shook his head without hesitation. No. One lie had just become impossible. Then I asked a question I hadn't planned to. Did anyone else ever bring the jewelry after my mother died? Harold frowned. I don't believe so. He clicked through several records. No appraisal requests. No ownership transfer. No. I thanked him. As we stood to leave, Harold hesitated. There is something. Ethan looked up. What is it? Harold rubbed his chin. A woman came in asking approximate resale values. My pulse quickened. When? He checked an appointment log. About 5 months after Isabella passed. Did she identify herself? I believe she said she was family. Can you describe her? Harold nodded. Blonde. Mid-50s. Very well dressed. Confident. Asked whether individual pieces would attract less attention if sold separately. Neither Ethan nor I spoke. Harold continued. I told her I don't advise clients on liquidation strategies. 5 months after Mom died, long before I'd ever questioned the safe, long before the anonymous pawn ticket arrived, someone had already been planning. Outside the building, Ethan stopped walking. That's important. I know. No. He looked directly at me. Do you understand why? I thought for a second. Because it shows planning? More than that. He lowered his voice. It shows intent. Intent. There was a legal difference between making a bad decision during financial hardship and systematically researching how to sell inherited property without attracting attention. One suggested desperation. The other suggested preparation. Over the following week, Ethan began sending formal requests for information wherever the law allowed. Insurance companies, auction houses, licensed dealers. Most declined politely. Privacy laws, confidentiality, client protection. Exactly what we expected. Then one unexpected response arrived. A regional jewelry dealer confirmed receiving an inquiry matching the necklace's description. No sale, only an inquiry. The contact name listed M. Vasquez. No first name, no address, no phone number. Still, it was another breadcrumb. The biggest obstacle remained the pawn shop. Illinois law required licensed pawn businesses to maintain detailed records. But they couldn't simply hand customer files to anyone who asked, not even family. When Ethan requested information, their attorney responded exactly as expected. We cannot release transaction records without proper legal authority. Frustrating, but understandable. We'll get the authority, Ethan said calmly. A few days later, while waiting outside Ethan's office after another meeting, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar Chicago number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. This is Ray Lynn. Silence. Then an older man's voice. I heard you've been asking questions about jewelry. My stomach tightened. Who is this? I can't tell you my name. Then why are you calling? I used to manage one of the pawn stores you're looking into. Used to. Not currently. I shouldn't even be making this call. Then why are you? Another long silence. Finally, he said, because I remember your mother's necklace. I glanced toward Ethan's office window. I need you to tell me everything. I can't over the phone. Why not? There are confidentiality agreements. Then why contact me at all? His answer surprised me. Because some rules protect honest people. He paused. Others protect the wrong ones. I leaned against my car. What do you remember? I remember the woman who brought it in. My heartbeat accelerated. Was it my stepmother? I can't answer that. You just said. I didn't say who. Another careful pause. But I remember she wasn't grieving. Those words stayed with me. Not grieving. Professional. Prepared. Almost businesslike. I also remember something else. What? She didn't come once. I closed my eyes. How many times? I lost count. He exhaled slowly, enough that employees started recognizing her. Before I could ask another question, he continued, "If your attorney obtains a subpoena, the records will speak for themselves." The line went dead. An hour later, Ethan read my notes from the conversation twice. Then he looked at me. "We're done asking politely." "What does that mean?" "It means we stop hoping someone volunteers the truth." He reached for a legal folder already sitting on his desk. "I've prepared the paperwork." I looked down. Across the top of the first page were the words, "Petition for subpoena of transaction records." Ethan picked up his pen. "If the court grants this, we won't be relying on memories anymore." He signed the final page. "And if the records say what I think they're going to say," he slid the folder toward me, "your stepmother's story is about to collapse under her own signature." 3 weeks later, Ethan called before 8 in the morning. The subpoena was granted. I was already reaching for my car keys before he finished the sentence. By the time I arrived at his office, a thick accordion folder sat on the conference table. No dramatic speeches, no celebration, just paperwork. That's how most lies actually fall apart. Not with confessions, with records. Ethan waited until I sat down before opening the folder. Everything in here came directly from the pawn company and their compliance department. He removed several stacks and arranged them carefully. Intake forms, identification records, transaction logs, photographs, payment receipts. He looked at me. "I want you to take your time." I nodded. My hands were steady. My stomach wasn't. The first document was an intake sheet. Item description: diamond necklace with platinum setting. Item identification matched exactly with my mother's insurance inventory. Date received 4 days after Isabella Vasquez's funeral. I stared at the date for several seconds. 4 days? Not 4 months? Not after financial hardship? Not during some desperate attempt to cover medical expenses? 4 days after we buried my mother. I turned the page. Attached was a copy of the seller's driver's license. Monica Vasquez. Address matched my father's home. License number, date of birth, signature, everything was there. There was no possibility of mistaken identity, no forged initials, no illegible handwriting. The compliance officer had copied every required document exactly as Illinois law demanded. I slowly exhaled. So she never expected anyone would see these? Ethan shook his head. Most people don't. The next folder contained photographs. Pawn shops routinely photographed valuable items before accepting them. Each image was time-stamped. Front, back, clasps, gemstone settings, serial engravings. I recognized every piece. The emerald bracelet, the sapphire earrings, the pearl brooch my grandfather had given Mom on their 25th anniversary, one after another. Each photograph felt less like evidence and more like another funeral. I wasn't mourning jewelry anymore. I was mourning moments. I remembered Mom wearing the emerald bracelet at my college graduation, the sapphire earrings at Christmas dinner, the brooch at my parents' anniversary party. Now those memories sat inside evidence files labeled with transaction numbers. I looked away from the photographs. I didn't expect this to hurt. Ethan answered quietly, "Evidence usually hurts more than suspicion. Because suspicion leaves room for hope. Evidence doesn't." Then we reached the payment records. Each sale had produced a check, not cash. Checks made payable to Monica Vasquez. Bank deposit confirmations were attached because transactions above a certain amount required additional documentation. One deposit, Then another, over 9 months. Never large enough individually to attract unusual attention, but together, the total exceeded $320,000. I looked at Ethan. She spread them out. Yes, so they wouldn't look unusual. Exactly. She hadn't panicked. She had planned. Sell one necklace. Wait several weeks. Sell a bracelet. Wait another month. Then earrings. Then another necklace. Never enough at once to raise questions inside the household. The empty jewelry boxes suddenly made perfect sense. She had left them exactly where they belonged, because replacing empty space with familiar routines is often enough to fool people who aren't looking closely. We kept reading. Then something unexpected appeared. A signed declaration completed during one transaction. Question relationship to original owner Monica had written gift from deceased family member prior to death. I frowned. She claimed Mom gave them to her. Yes. But now she's saying Mom sold them herself. Ethan nodded. 2 completely different stories. And both can't be true. Correct. I read every declaration. The wording changed slightly from transaction to transaction. Sometimes Monica described the jewelry as gifts. Other times she referred to inherited property. One form even stated personal property acquired before marriage. Ethan tapped the page. She wasn't keeping track of her own lies. That observation chilled me. When people tell the truth, details usually remain consistent. When they invent stories over months, they eventually forget which version they've already told. I thought we'd reached the end. We hadn't. The final envelope contained internal compliance notes. Employees occasionally documented unusual customer interactions. Most entries were routine. Customer requested appraisal. Customer returned with identification. Waiting for authorization. Then one paragraph caught my attention. Customer requested discretion due to family disagreements. Asked whether transactions remain confidential from relatives. Explained legal privacy protections. Customer appeared relieved. No names, only customer. But the date matched one of Monica's visits. I closed my eyes. She hadn't simply sold my mother's jewelry. She had specifically asked whether I could discover it. She wasn't afraid of doing something wrong. She was afraid of getting caught. That afternoon, Ethan and I drove to my father's house. Not to confront Monica. Not yet. Dad deserved to see everything first. He opened the front door wearing old jeans and a faded Cubs sweatshirt. You sounded serious. We are. We sat around the dining room table where countless birthdays, holidays, and Sunday dinners had taken place. Ethan organized the documents in silence. Dad looked confused. What's all this? I slid the first intake form toward him. He adjusted his reading glasses. His eyes moved slowly across the page, then stopped. No. He looked again. No. He picked up the copy of Monica's driver's license. No. His voice had become almost a whisper. This can't. He reached for the photographs. His hands began shaking. I remember this necklace. I bought it after our 10th anniversary. He looked at me. Your mother wore it every New Year's Eve. I nodded. I know. He continued turning pages. The emerald bracelet, the sapphire earrings, another necklace, another bracelet, another signature, another payment. His breathing became noticeably uneven. I didn't know. I believe you, I said quietly. He covered his face with both hands. I didn't know. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The front door opened. Monica walked inside carrying grocery bags. She stopped the instant she saw all of us sitting together. What is this? Dad didn't answer. He simply pushed the first intake sheet across the table. She looked at it, then at Ethan, then at me. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not surprise, calculation. She set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. "Where did you get these?" Ethan answered. "Through lawful discovery." She laughed once, a short, nervous laugh. "I can explain." Dad finally looked up. "I'd like you to." She sat down slowly. "I was trying to protect us." I frowned. "Protect who?" "Our family." "By selling Mom's jewelry?" "We needed money." Dad stared at her. "What money?" She hesitated. "The retirement transition." "What retirement transition?" "The expenses. We weren't broke." "I didn't say we were broke." Dad leaned forward. "Then tell me exactly what we needed $300,000 for." For the first time since this nightmare had begun. Monica didn't have an immediate answer. Instead, she looked at the documents scattered across the table, almost as though she were seeing them for the first time herself. Then she quietly said something none of us expected. "It wasn't just the jewelry." The room went completely silent. Dad slowly lowered his glasses. "What do you mean?" It wasn't just the jewelry." No one spoke for several seconds. Monica looked down at her hands instead of at any of us. She had spent nearly an hour denying, redirecting, and minimizing. Now she suddenly seemed exhausted. "It wasn't just the jewelry," she repeated softly. Dad leaned forward. "Monica." His voice wasn't angry. It was confused. "What are you talking about?" She swallowed. "I borrowed money." "How much?" She didn't answer. "Monica, I don't remember the exact amount." That answer alone told me it was substantial. People forget the exact balance on a credit card. They don't forget whether they borrowed $5,000 or $500,000. Ethan quietly closed one folder and opened another. "We already suspected debt." Monica's eyes shot toward him. "What?" He slid several public record printouts across the table. "We ran a financial background check after the subpoena was approved." Dad looked surprised. "You can do that." "Only through lawful public sources and with information relevant to ongoing litigation." I glanced at the documents. They weren't bank statements. They were court records, civil filings, financing statements, property liens. Nothing private. Everything publicly available. Something I should have checked weeks earlier. Monica finally looked at me. "I wasn't gambling." "I never thought you were." "I wasn't buying drugs." "I never thought that either." "I wasn't trying to destroy this family." Her voice cracked. "I thought I was saving it." Dad had stared at her. "Saving it from what?" She laughed bitterly. "From looking like we'd failed." That answer caught all of us off guard. She continued before anyone interrupted. "When you retired," she looked at Dad, "your income dropped." Dad nodded slowly. "I knew that." "But our friends didn't." She wiped at her eyes. "They kept traveling. They renovated kitchens. They joined expensive clubs. They talked about second homes." I couldn't stand feeling like we'd become the struggling couple. Dad looked almost bewildered. "We weren't struggling." "I know that now." "No." He shook his head. "We weren't struggling then either." Monica closed her eyes. I convinced myself appearances mattered. She explained that she had begun using credit cards more freely. A luxury SUV lease, designer furniture, vacations she insisted were once in a lifetime, private club memberships, cosmetic procedures she claimed were investments in her confidence. At first she paid everything on time, then interest accumulated. She refinanced balances, opened new accounts, transferred debt between lenders. By the time she admitted there was a problem to herself, not to anyone else, the payments had become impossible to manage. "So you sold Isabella's jewelry," I said quietly. She nodded once. I told myself I'd replace everything before either of you ever noticed. Dad looked physically ill. You sold your late wife's jewelry. Because you didn't want your friends thinking we had less money? It wasn't that simple. It sounds exactly that simple. I panicked. You planned this for 9 months. I was trying to fix it. No. His voice remained calm, which somehow made it more painful. You were trying to hide it. Monica didn't argue. Because she couldn't. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt strangely empty. This wasn't some elaborate inheritance conspiracy. There hadn't been secret business partners, no hidden criminal organization, no mysterious collector targeting our family. It was smaller than that, and somehow sadder. One person's fear of looking unsuccessful had consumed decades of someone else's memories. There has to be more, I finally said. Monica looked at me. What do you mean? I reached for one of the pawn records. You started selling 4 days after Mom's funeral. She nodded weakly. Yes. You weren't drowning in debt 4 days after the funeral. Silence. You couldn't have. She looked away. I continued. So what changed? Nothing. No answer. I repeated the question. What happened before that first sale? She remained completely still. Ethan watched quietly. He wasn't interrupting because he knew the timeline mattered. People often confessed to broad ideas. The sequence was where the truth usually emerged. Finally, Monica whispered, I received a letter. Dad frowned. What letter? A demand letter. From who? My lender. She looked embarrassed. They threatened legal action. When? The week after Isabella died. Dad stared at her. You were already that deep in debt. She nodded. Why didn't you tell me? I was ashamed. So instead you sold my wife's property. I thought I could fix everything before you ever found out. Dad stood up from the table and walked toward the kitchen window. He didn't say anything for nearly a minute. When he finally spoke, his back was still turned toward us. You know what hurts the most? Monica looked up hopefully. I never cared about impressing those people. Silence. I would have sold the SUV. I would have canceled every vacation. I would have left every country club. I would have moved into a smaller house if we had to. He slowly turned around, but I would have never sold Isabella's memories. Monica lowered her head. I know. No. He shook his head gently. I don't think you do. Ethan cleared his throat. There is something everyone should understand. We all looked toward him. The debt explains motive. He tapped the stack of documents. The pawn records prove the sales. The insurance records establish ownership. He paused. But there's still one legal question we haven't answered. Dad frowned. What question? Whether Monica actually had any legal authority to sell those items. Monica immediately looked up. I was Daniel's wife. Ethan nodded politely. I understand. And I lived in the house. I understand. I had access to the safe. I understand. She leaned forward. So I had the right. Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he opened a separate folder. That depends. He removed a document I hadn't seen before. It depends entirely on how Isabella's estate was structured. I frowned. I thought everything went through probate. Most of it did. There are indications that not everything was treated the same way. Dad looked confused. What does that mean? It means certain assets can remain separate property. He looked down at the document again. And if these jewelry pieces were legally designated as Isabella's separate property, he let the sentence hang for a moment, then Monica never had ownership and never had the legal authority to sell even one piece. The room fell silent again. Monica's face lost what little color it had left. For the first time that day, she didn't try to defend herself. She didn't argue. She didn't offer another explanation. She simply stared at the document in Ethan's hand. Then she whispered almost to herself, "I didn't know she signed that." I looked at Ethan. "You've seen something, haven't you?" He nodded once. "I think I know where the missing answer is." He carefully closed the folder before anyone else could read it. "But before we make any conclusions, I need to obtain one document from Isabella's estate file." I barely slept that night. Not because I was worried about what Ethan might find, because of what Monica had said. "I didn't know she signed that." She hadn't said, "I don't know what you're talking about." She hadn't said, "There is no such document." She had said she didn't know my mother had signed it. Those were two very different things. Someone who lies often tells the truth accidentally in the middle of a sentence. I kept hearing those words over and over. She didn't deny the document existed. She admitted she hadn't expected it. The following afternoon, Ethan called. "I have it." I left work early. When I arrived at his office, he was standing beside the conference table with a thin gray file. Compared to the stacks of evidence we'd already collected, it looked almost insignificant. Just a few pages. But Ethan smiled the moment I walked in. "I've been waiting to show you this." He opened the file carefully. The probate court didn't have what I needed. I frowned. "Then where did you find it?" "Your mother's estate planning attorney retained a duplicate." "My mother had another attorney." "Yes." "I thought everything went through Dad's lawyer." "So did Monica." He slid the first page toward me. At the top was my mother's name, Isabella Marie Vasquez. Beneath it, personal property memorandum. I looked at Ethan. "I've never seen this." "I'm not surprised. It wasn't filed with the will because it didn't have to be." He pointed to several highlighted paragraphs. "Your mother's will specifically incorporated any properly executed personal property memorandum." "So this was legally connected to the will." "Exactly." I began reading. The document listed dozens of personal belongings, furniture, artwork, family photographs, books, keepsakes. Then I reached the jewelry section. Every single item was listed. The diamond necklace, the emerald bracelet, the sapphire earrings, the pearl brooch, the vintage engagement ring from my great-grandmother. Each line ended exactly the same way. "To be distributed to my daughter, Raylyn Vasquez." I stopped reading. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Mom hadn't simply wanted me to have the jewelry. She had documented it individually, piece by piece, exactly the way she documented everything else in her life. Ethan handed me another page. "This matters even more." It was signed, dated, witnessed, notarized, completely valid. My mother's signature sat neatly above the date. 3 years before her cancer diagnosis, not during treatment, not while medicated, not under emotional pressure. She had planned everything while healthy, long before anyone imagined she would become ill. I traced my finger lightly across her signature. "I can almost see her writing this." Ethan nodded. People who organize their affairs this carefully rarely leave major questions unanswered. I laughed softly through tears. "She always said paperwork protects the truth." I think she was right. There was one final attachment, an amendment, only a single page long. Its purpose was simple: to clarify that the jewelry collection remained Isabella's separate personal property regardless of where it was stored after her death. Even if it remained inside the marital home, even if another family member had physical possession, even if someone else had access to the safe. Ownership never changed. I looked up slowly. "So Monica never owned any of it?" Ethan shook his head. "Not legally. Not even after marrying Dad, no. Not even after moving into the house, no. Not even if Dad gave her the safe combination. Access isn't ownership. That sentence stayed with me. Access isn't ownership. It's true in accounting. It's true in banking. And apparently, it's true in estate law. Ethan leaned back. From a legal standpoint, the situation is now much clearer. He arranged 4 groups of documents across the table. First, he pointed to the insurance records. These prove the jewelry existed shortly before Isabella passed away. Second, the pawn records. These prove Monica sold the items. Third, the financial records. These eliminate her explanation that Isabella sold them during treatment. And fourth, he rested his hand on the memorandum. This establishes legal ownership. The sequence was almost impossible to challenge. Every excuse Monica had offered now conflicted with documented evidence. Not opinions, documents. So what happens now? Ethan folded his hands. I contacted Monica's attorney this morning. I blinked. Already? I wanted to give them an opportunity to review everything before we filed additional claims. Did they respond? They asked for copies. And I sent them. I waited. What happened? They called back 2 hours later. What did they say? Ethan smiled faintly. Not much. Meaning, they stopped arguing. The following morning, Monica's attorney requested a settlement meeting. No accusations, no public hearings, no interviews. Just a formal request to negotiate. When Ethan told me I wasn't surprised, if I had represented Monica, I would have advised the same thing, because evidence doesn't become weaker simply because a courtroom is avoided. The facts remained the same. The meeting took place in a private conference room downtown. Monica arrived with her attorney. Dad came separately. He looked exhausted, older than he had only a month earlier. Monica wouldn't meet my eyes. She had traded confidence for silence. After everyone sat down, Ethan spoke first. We're prepared to resolve this efficiently. Monica's attorney nodded. My client wishes to avoid unnecessary litigation. Ethan slid copies of the memorandum across the table. I assume you've reviewed these. The attorney looked toward Monica. She nodded weakly. Yes. No. No objections to authenticity. No. No dispute regarding ownership. A longer pause. Finally. No. That single word changed everything. For weeks we had argued over stories. Now we were discussing consequences. Monica spoke for the first time. I never wanted any of this. I looked directly at her. Neither did I. She took a slow breath. I thought I could replace everything. You sold memories. I know. You sold them 4 days after we buried my mother. Tears filled her eyes. I know. I opened empty jewelry boxes because I trusted you. She looked down. I know. For the first time since this began. She wasn't defending herself. She wasn't rewriting history. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She simply looked defeated. Then her attorney quietly placed another folder on the table. I believe my client would like to make an offer. Ethan opened it. His expression didn't change. He read every page carefully, then he handed the proposal to me. The settlement included financial compensation approaching the full appraised value of every missing piece. It also included Monica's agreement to cooperate in locating jewelry that had already entered private collections. But near the end of the document, one paragraph caught my attention. I read it twice before looking up. They want confidentiality. Ethan nodded. They're asking that you agree never to discuss Monica's actions publicly or within the extended family. I closed the folder slowly. Across the table, Monica finally looked at me again. There was hope in her expression. Not hope that I'd forgive her. Hope that money could still protect her reputation. I already knew my answer. I closed the settlement proposal and slid it back across the conference table. I can't sign this. Monica's attorney didn't look surprised. Instead, he asked politely, "May I ask which provision concerns you?" I tapped the final page. "The confidentiality clause." He nodded. "My client believes privacy would benefit everyone involved." "I disagree," Monica finally spoke. "Raylyn, I'm not asking you to lie." No. "Then what exactly are you asking me to do?" She hesitated. "To let the family move forward." I held her gaze. "You don't move forward by pretending something never happened." The room fell quiet. Her attorney leaned forward. "To clarify, Ms. Vasquez, the agreement doesn't require you to make false statements. It simply limits future public discussion." "I understand exactly what it does." Ethan remained silent. He knew I didn't need help answering. I continued. "If I sign this, every future family gathering becomes dishonest." No one responded. "My cousins will wonder why Mom's jewelry disappeared." "My aunt will ask why none of us ever wears Grandma Elena's bracelet anymore." "My mother's friends will remember her favorite necklace." I looked directly at Monica. "And every time someone asks, everyone in this room will be expected to protect the person who sold them." Monica lowered her eyes. "I've already protected someone else's secrets for almost a year. I'm done doing that." The meeting ended without an agreement. Not because either side wanted a trial, because we needed different terms. Outside the building, Ethan and I walked toward the parking garage in silence. Finally, he asked, "Any regrets?" "No." "You realize you probably could have settled today?" "I know." "You also realize litigation could take months?" "I know." He smiled faintly. "I thought you'd answer that way." I laughed softly. Was I predictable? In the best possible sense? He unlocked his car. "Most people think justice and revenge are the same thing." "They aren't." "No." He looked at me. "Revenge tries to make someone suffer. Justice simply refuses to hide the truth." That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. 3 days later, Monica's attorney called Ethan. The confidentiality clause was gone. So was another provision requiring both sides to release all future civil claims immediately. Instead, the revised proposal contained something very different. Monica agreed to cooperate fully in recovering any jewelry that could still be traced. She also agreed to provide every receipt lender statement email and transaction related to the sales. No more selective memories. No more partial explanations. Everything. I approved the revised terms, not because I suddenly trusted Monica, because written obligations are enforceable. Promises aren't. Over the next several weeks, we began contacting auction houses and licensed jewelry dealers. Some pieces had disappeared into private collections. Those were likely gone forever. Others had changed hands only once. A few dealers were surprisingly cooperative after learning the circumstances. One necklace was still sitting in a secure vault waiting for resale. The sapphire earrings had never been displayed publicly. The emerald bracelet had been purchased by a collector in Wisconsin who had no idea it was connected to a legal dispute. Every recovered item felt strangely emotional, not triumphant, just quiet. The first package arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Ethan insisted I open it in his office because the chain of custody still mattered. Inside was a small velvet box. When I lifted the lid, the sapphire earrings rested exactly as I remembered them. For a moment, I wasn't 36 years old anymore. I was 12. Standing in my parents' kitchen while Mom hurried to get ready for a charity dinner. She had smiled into the hallway mirror while fastening those same earrings. Then she looked at me and asked, "Too much." I had laughed. "They sparkle when you smile." She hugged me before leaving. That memory returned with such clarity that I had to close the box again. Jewelry isn't just metal. Sometimes it's a doorway. Not every search ended well. Several auction houses informed us the items had already been resold internationally. Some buyers refused to sell. Others couldn't legally be identified because of privacy protections. Every negative response hurt. But something surprised me. The more pieces we failed to recover, the less I obsessed over owning them again. At first, I thought my goal was bringing every item home. Eventually, I realized that wasn't true. My real goal had been proving my mother hadn't abandoned them. That mattered more. Nobody could ever again claim Isabella sold her family's history. The documents had protected her, exactly as she always believed they would. One afternoon, Monica asked if she could speak with me privately. We met in Ethan's office with the conference room door left open. Neither of us wanted misunderstandings. She looked smaller somehow, less polished, less certain. "I owe you something. You already owe me quite a lot." "I know." She nodded slowly. "I'm talking about an explanation." I waited. She clasped her hands together. "When I first sold the necklace, I cried all the way home." I didn't respond. I told myself it would only be one piece. Then the next payment came due, and another, and another. She looked at the floor. After a while, selling them became easier than admitting what I'd done. That strangely was the most honest sentence she'd spoken since this began, not because it excused anything, because it explained something. Shame often grows in silence. Every lie requires another lie to protect it, until eventually the original decision almost disappears beneath the weight of everything built on top of it. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly. "I wasn't planning to offer it today." She nodded. "I understand. I do forgive one thing." She looked up. "What?" "I believe you really thought you could fix it." Hope flickered across her face. Then I finished my sentence. "But believing that never gave you the right to gamble with my mother's memories." The hope disappeared again, and that was the truth. Compassion doesn't erase accountability. A week later, Dad invited me over for dinner. Just the two of us. When I arrived, the house felt unfamiliar, not because furniture had changed, because Monica had already moved into a temporary apartment while the legal process continued. The silence reminded me of the months after Mom died. Dad served grilled salmon and roasted vegetables. Halfway through dinner, he set down his fork. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About how many times I chose peace instead of paying attention." I didn't interrupt. I kept telling myself avoiding conflict made me a good husband. He stared at his plate. "Maybe sometimes it just makes someone absent." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. He looked at me with tired eyes. "I'd like to earn your trust again." I smiled gently. "I hope you do." He nodded. "I know hope isn't enough." "No, it isn't." We both understood that rebuilding trust isn't a conversation. It's a pattern, repeated over time. Just before I left, Dad handed me a small envelope. "I found this while cleaning the study." Inside was an old photograph. Mom stood in the backyard laughing. Around her neck was the diamond necklace that had started this entire journey. On the back, written in her unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words. "Wear it when life feels worth celebrating." I stared at the sentence for a long time. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of the auctions specialist we'd been working with for weeks. When I answered, she said only one sentence. "Ms. Vasquez? I think we found your mother's diamond necklace." For a moment, I couldn't answer. The auction specialist repeated herself. "Ms. Vasquez, I'm here." "I believe we've located the necklace." I looked at the photograph still lying in my father's hands. The one where my mother was laughing in the backyard with the diamond necklace resting against a blue summer dress. My throat tightened. "Are you certain?" "We're about 95% confident." 95? The buyer recently contacted us about consigning it for a future sale. My heart skipped. "So, it hasn't been sold again?" "No. It has remained in the same private collection." I closed my eyes. After months of chasing paperwork, timelines, signatures, and legal documents, the piece that had started everything might actually be coming home. The following Tuesday, Ethan and I met the auction specialist in a secure viewing room. Unlike the glamorous auction houses shown in movies, this building was surprisingly ordinary. Gray walls, fluorescent lights, security cameras, locked doors. Every visitor signed multiple documents before entering. The specialist introduced herself as Claire Donnelly. She placed a sealed evidence container on the table. The owner agreed to let us verify the piece before deciding whether to sell it. She carefully unlocked the container. Inside rested a familiar velvet presentation box. Not my mother's original box, a replacement. Claire put on white cotton gloves before lifting the necklace. The diamonds caught the light immediately. Beautiful, elegant, painfully familiar. But Ethan didn't reach for it. Neither did I. Instead, I removed the appraisal file from my bag. Claire smiled. "I had a feeling you'd bring documentation." I brought everything. We compared every measurable detail. Stone arrangement, prong design, weight, metal markings, repair history. Then I looked underneath the clasp. Almost invisible unless you knew where to search, were 3 tiny engraved initials. Years earlier, after having the clasp repaired, Mom had asked the jeweler to engrave her initials inside because she worried identical necklaces could someday be confused during insurance claims. I remembered teasing her. "Who's ever going to check inside the clasp?" She had smiled. "You never know." Now, those 3 letters identified the necklace more convincingly than any photograph ever could. Claire looked at me. "I believe this belongs to your family." "For the first time in months," I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way grief often arrives when hope finally catches up with it. The owner of the necklace wasn't present. Claire explained that after learning the full history, he had immediately suspended the planned auction. "He had no idea." "I believe him. He purchased it through a legitimate dealer." "I know. No one has accused him of wrongdoing." That mattered. Justice isn't about punishing innocent people who unknowingly buy stolen property. It's about following the truth wherever it leads. The owner had every legal right to seek reimbursement through the dealer who sold it. The dealer, in turn, could pursue the previous seller. The law had its own chain of accountability. Not perfect, but fair. Several weeks later, the final settlement was signed. Monica agreed to additional financial restitution for jewelry that could never be recovered. She transferred ownership of several personal investments to satisfy part of the obligation. She also accepted civil liability for the unauthorized sales. No criminal charges were filed. Not because what happened wasn't serious, but because every party involved, including my father and me, ultimately agreed that restitution documented accountability and full cooperation better served everyone than years of criminal litigation. Some people later asked whether I regretted that decision. I never did. Justice isn't measured only by prison sentences. Sometimes it's measured by complete responsibility. Monica lost nearly everything she had spent years trying to protect. Her savings, her reputation inside the family, her marriage. Most importantly, the trust no amount of money could ever purchase again. A month after the settlement became final, Dad called. "Would you meet me at Mom's favorite park?" I knew exactly which one. Lincoln Park had been her escape long before it became mine. The lake shimmered beneath a bright autumn sky. Children played near the walking paths. Joggers passed every few minutes. Life continued. Dad was already sitting on the same wooden bench where Mom used to drink coffee on Sunday mornings. He looked up as I approached. "You found it." His eyes rested on the necklace around my neck. I nodded. "I thought today was the right day to wear it." He smiled sadly. "So did I." For several minutes we watched the lake without speaking. Finally, Dad broke the silence. "I've apologized 100 times in my head. You don't owe me 100 speeches." "I owe you better choices." I nodded. "That's true." He laughed softly. "You always were honest." "I learned from Mom." His smile faded into tears. "So did I." He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a folded envelope. "I found this while organizing the attic." Inside was one sheet of stationery, my mother's handwriting. It wasn't a legal document, not a will, not instructions, just a note she had written years earlier after updating her estate plans. It read, "Daniel, if you're reading this someday without me, promise me one thing. Don't protect my memory by protecting my belongings. Protect it by protecting our daughter. She'll never ask for more than fairness. Please don't mistake her quietness for weakness." I couldn't finish reading aloud. Dad covered his eyes. "I failed her." I folded the letter carefully. "You failed both of us." "I know, but you're here now." He nodded. "I want to keep showing up." "I'll let you." He looked surprised. "You will." "I said I'd give you the chance. I didn't say everything goes back to the way it was." He understood immediately. Trust wasn't returning. It was beginning again. Slowly, honestly, one decision at a time. Before we left the park, Dad asked one last question. "What about Monica?" I looked across the water before answering. "I don't hate her." He seemed relieved. "But I don't trust her." He nodded. "I don't know if she'll ever be part of my life again." "That's fair. I hope she gets help." "So do I." "But hope isn't the same as access." Dad smiled faintly. "Your mother would have said exactly that." As we stood to leave, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan. "One final document just arrived from the former pawn shop manager. I think you'll want to read it before we close the file for good." I looked at the screen for a long moment. After everything that had happened, I honestly believed there couldn't possibly be one more surprise. I was wrong. By the time I reached Ethan's office the next morning, the file that had consumed nearly a year of my life was sitting in the center of the conference table. For months, every meeting in this room had uncovered another lie, another receipt, another signature, another missing piece of my mother's story. This time, there was only one sealed envelope. Ethan looked at me with a small smile. "I think this is the last unanswered question." I sat down. "The former pawn shop manager." He nodded. "He finally received permission from his former employer's legal department to provide a written statement." "So he can tell us who sent the pawn ticket?" "Yes." I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a signed affidavit. Not a dramatic confession, not a secret recording, just 3 typed pages. Exactly the kind of document my mother would have appreciated. Clear, organized, honest. The former manager's name was Thomas Keller. He explained that after retiring, he had been contacted by attorneys representing the pawn company during our subpoena request. While reviewing archived transaction files, he recognized my mother's necklace immediately. Not because it was unusually valuable, because he remembered the woman who brought it in. Monica had visited the shop repeatedly over several months. She was always polite, always organized, always carried complete identification. She never appeared nervous enough to attract suspicion. Everything she did looked legal. But something had bothered him. Each time she sold another piece, she asked the same question. Will the family ever find out? Thomas wrote that employees always gave the same answer. We're required to keep customer information confidential unless disclosure is required by law. Every time she heard that answer, she relaxed. At first, he thought she was simply trying to avoid uncomfortable family arguments. Years later, when the subpoena arrived and he reviewed the inventory photographs, he remembered something else. One afternoon, Monica had accidentally referred to one necklace as my husband's late wife's favorite. That sentence stayed with him, not because it proved a crime, because it suggested the jewelry had never truly belonged to Monica emotionally. He wrote that he had considered contacting someone after retirement, but wasn't sure whether he legally could. Then he saw Ethan's name listed as the attorney requesting records. Instead of contacting the police, the media, or my father, he mailed one anonymous pawn ticket to Ethan. He wanted the truth to reach the person who actually had the legal ability to investigate it. He ended his statement with one sentence that made me unexpectedly emotional. I couldn't undo what had already happened, but I didn't want silence to become part of the theft. I folded the affidavit carefully. I'd like to thank him. Ethan smiled. I already asked. And he said he doesn't want recognition. Nothing. He told me the best thank you would be knowing your mother wasn't remembered as someone who abandoned her family's history. I looked down at the necklace resting against my sweater. He gave me that. Over the next several months, the remaining legal paperwork was finalized. Some pieces of jewelry returned, others never did. The emerald bracelet eventually came home after its owner accepted reimbursement through the insurance process. The sapphire earrings returned from Wisconsin. The pearl brooch was located in a dealer's private inventory, but several heirlooms were gone forever. At first, I struggled with that. Then one afternoon, I opened my mother's blue binder again. This time, I wasn't looking for evidence. I was simply reading. Inside one plastic sleeve, I found an old family photograph that had somehow escaped my attention. My grandmother was wearing one of the missing bracelets. My great-grandmother wore another. Suddenly, I realized something. The jewelry had never been the only place those memories existed. They also lived in photographs, letters, holiday traditions, stories, and in me. No one could pawn those. About 6 months after the settlement, Dad invited me to lunch. He looked healthier than he had in years. Therapy had helped. Retirement finally looked peaceful instead of frightening. He had sold the oversized house and moved into a modest condominium overlooking a small park. I don't need 6 bedrooms, he joked. You never did. We laughed. Real laughter. The kind that doesn't feel guilty afterward. As we finished eating, he handed me a small wooden box. I had this made. Inside was a velvet tray designed specifically to hold the jewelry we had recovered, not locked inside a safe, displayed beneath glass, alongside photographs of Mom wearing each piece. A brass plaque inside the lid read, Isabella Vasquez. Her legacy was never measured by what she owned, but by the love she left behind. I ran my fingers across the engraving. It's beautiful. I thought she'd rather be remembered than hidden. So do I. A few weeks later, I used part of the settlement money to establish a nursing scholarship at the community college where my mother had earned her degree decades earlier. Not because it erased what happened. Nothing could. But because it transformed something painful into something useful. Each year, one student facing financial hardship would receive assistance in Isabella Vasquez's name. When the college asked why I wanted to create the scholarship, I answered honestly. My mother believed care should always outlive the person giving it. That felt like the inheritance she had always intended to leave. People sometimes ask whether I ever forgave Monica. The answer is complicated. I no longer carry anger every day. Anger is exhausting. Eventually, I chose peace for myself. But peace and access are not the same thing. I don't invite Monica to family holidays. I don't share personal milestones with her. I don't leave space in my life for someone who repeatedly proved she couldn't be trusted. Forgiveness helped me heal. Boundaries helped me stay healed. Those two things are often confused. They're not the same. Dad and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, not through promises, through consistency. He showed up. He listened. He accepted responsibility without asking me to make him feel better. Trust returned one ordinary day at a time, exactly the way it had been lost. Sometimes before leaving for work, I fasten my mother's diamond necklace around my neck. Not because it's the most valuable piece we recovered, because it reminds me of something far more valuable. The truth can disappear for a while. It can be buried beneath grief, manipulation, silence, even carefully constructed lies. But if someone cared enough to preserve the evidence, and if someone else cared enough to follow it patiently, the truth has an extraordinary way of finding its way home. Family betrayal rarely begins with one terrible decision. More often, it begins with small compromises that grow larger each time someone chooses silence over honesty. When the people closest to us misuse our trust, it's natural to question ourselves. We wonder whether we should have noticed sooner, spoken up earlier, or protected what mattered more carefully. But healing doesn't come from blaming ourselves for someone else's choices. It comes from accepting the truth, learning from it, and creating healthier boundaries going forward. If you've ever been taken advantage of by someone you loved, I hope this story reminds you that protecting yourself isn't an act of revenge. Seeking evidence isn't cruelty. Using the law when necessary isn't heartless. And forgiveness, when it comes, never requires you to restore the same level of access to the person who broke your trust. Reconciliation is earned through consistent actions, not requested through apologies alone. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between keeping family peace and standing up for the truth? Share your experience in the comments because your story may encourage someone else who feels alone. If stories like this resonate with you, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.